Yeah, I suppose if I'm to talk about the best villains in Fire Emblem, it's only fair that I address the worst ones as well. Now, villains in Fire Emblem don't get a good rap in general, mainly because fans don't come to these games to be engrossed by the threat the same way other series fans were. It's a shame too, because in my opinion, this series is on par with classic Disney, Batman, and Ace Attorney for having a lot of enjoyable and interesting villains, which is why I feel the need to demonstrate what actual bad Fire Emblem villains are like.
On the one hand, gold. On the other hand, painful, agonizing failure.
Just to clarify, these aren't hate sinks like Hilda, Sonia, and Valter. These are actual poorly made villains. Bland, annoying, missed potential, badly designed, or ironically unsympathetic. I'm also gonna try to avoid going for one-off Mook villains because, let's face it, that's too easy. These are my top 10 worst Fire Emblem villains. The Evil Dragon Archetype. You might have noticed that I hardly touched upon these guys on both of my favorites list. I'll be honest, it's hard for me to measure these guys as villains since oftentimes they lack any sort of dynamic and are just the final obstacle in your path to victory. Sure, they can be fun so long as they have great lore, cool design, and epic boss fights, but even then it's easier to screw that up compared to getting it right, to the point where they can easily make some of the worst villains in the series. So take this with a grain of salt, but I'm kicking off the list with Grima.
What is the meaning of this?
Yeah, I know, a lot of people love Grima. They are one of the more popular villains in the series. And to be fair, Grima does kick off with a pretty good first impression. Their enormous size towers over any other entity in Fire Emblem. The shrill, echoing voice, the 6 glowing eyes, so much about it just screams Eldritch and it's amazing. What a way to set up an ultimate threat. Their backstory is also interesting, being an experiment who was betrayed by their own creator, ultimately turning it into a being who knows nothing more than to kill and eat until they become powerful beyond comprehension. So they're pretty much just an all-destroying entity, but with all the build-up and lore surrounding them, it seems like they will certainly leave a lasting mark as one of the series' greatest monsters. So how did they mess it up?
Orange, I'm you, from the year 2053. What? I'm from the future!
Yeah, for some reason, someone thought it's a good idea to turn a giant, all-powerful Eldritch Dragon into the Avatar's doppelganger from another timeline. And it's really lame. On top of just copy-pasting the Avatar's design, nothing interesting was done with the idea. They didn't switch places with Robin, they didn't have any sort of psychological confrontation, it's just there. Hell, the plan doesn't even make sense. Why follow Lucina into another timeline? Is it to stop her from altering destiny? If time paradox is a thing in this story, they intervened right after Valadar was killed. They shouldn't be able to do anything after that. And the fact that they can at all means that their worries are completely pointless. And don't even get me started on the plan to combine the two Grima's powers. Nothing was done from a gameplay standpoint when it comes to these two working together. You don't even fight the dragon, you just fight the Avatar. And when you're done, both Grimas perish together.
Nice work, bitch!
Grima has an astounding setup ruined by a gimmicky payoff. And it's not like it couldn't have worked either. Ashnart and Ashura both came before it and have way more challenging and interesting fights. But when it comes to fighting a big scary dragon, it's not until Fate's Revelations do they finally figure out how to do it right. I don't want to be too harsh on Grima. I get why people like them, especially with all the extended story given to them in Echoes and Heroes, even if those didn't really do much to redeem them for me. Maybe if Awakening had been my first FE, I would have been much nicer towards Grima, but as it stands, no such rose-tinted glasses are here to stop me from seeing them for what they really are. An overrated letdown. For all the praises Three Houses gets with its world building and deep characters, it still can't escape the modern FE trend of having really crappy villains. Aside from the two big bitches with the Grey Coast, so many of the adversaries you come across are really shallow to the point where they serve more as padded obstacles rather than actual villains or characters. This carries over to one of the game's recurring antagonists, the Death Knight. Being real for a moment, I almost didn't put this guy on the list because he's so poorly integrated into the story, I forgot he's supposed to be a villain. For an antagonist who is built up throughout the game as a major threat to the protagonist, there is barely any focus given to the presence of his character. All he has going for him is that try-hard edgy design and voice, which really doesn't save him by much. Whenever he's on screen, all he does is stand around and wait for things to happen. He's supposed to be this imposing entity that you're advised not to approach, but he's so easily exploitable that he might as well be relegated as a Darksteel delivery boy. This will be fine if he actually does something in the story that defines his character, but he can't even do that right. He's supposed to be Edelgard's trump card, the big cheese of the Adrestia army, but he barely interacts with her, and his feats, what few thereof, don't really entail anything about his personality. Was there even an attempt to give this guy any sort of depth? Well, yeah, there is. He's Mercedes' brother. They meet a bit in Azure Moon, and that's it. The one interesting thing he has going for him, and it's still irrelevant to the plot. Seriously, why even have this guy at all if he does so little to stand out? If you take him out of the story and have, I don't know, Randolph do everything he did, I don't think it will have changed much. Yeah, I know what they're trying to do. They want to keep him mysterious so that you'll have the incentive to check out the other routes to find out more about him. But 3 routes where he just does the same thing? By that point, I'm already too tired to give a rat's ass over what his agenda is. And on the topic of learning more about him, he's an ally in Crimson Flower. But guess what? You can't even recruit him until the first patch update. Imagine my utter frustration after just getting done beating one of my least favorite storylines in the whole series, only for the game to drop this as incentive for round 2. All I can say to that is,
oh, hell no!
Okay, to be fair, I do like how Death Knight is portrayed as a split personality created from a trauma. But considering we didn't get this bit of story in the initial package, he still feels like a rushed byproduct that only further shows the small priority the story has for its secondary villains. Say what you will about Nurgle and Sephiran, at least their backstories are part of the initial games respectively. Having multiple routes should not be an excuse to hide core details about a character. It should instead be an incentive to show different aspects of them, rewarding players with finer details rather than taunting them with vital ones. Even Fates is able to pull this off right. Sorry Yaritza, but there just isn't enough Scythes of Sariel around to buy back the attention you lost me. Remember when Fire Emblem villains actually have memorable designs? Remember when the artists care enough to give them colors and details that define their personalities and really make them stand out? Remember when they don't just dress a thumb in a shrub and try to pass that off as a major villain? Thank goodness for Engage, because good lord, what was Fates even on when they made Hans? First of all, just look at him. He's the most generic, uninteresting bandit you'll ever see. Even the brigands in the older games have better designs because at least you remember how ugly they are. And it's not like it couldn't have been better either. This game has a Berserker mini-boss that has a much more appealing design. So why not just use that one? Is it because they don't want people to think Hans looks cool since they're supposed to hate him?
That's bullshit!
Second, personality. What personality? He's just a brainless pillager who goes around killing people. Ironic, considering the game tries to get you to feel sorry for a character that also just wants to kill people for no reason. Hell, he's not even that cunning. He keeps making dumb excuses and gets away with it because it's Garen's orders, and everyone is too stupid to realize how irredeemable that scrotum-faced tyrant is. Oh, trust me, we'll get to him soon. And I know what you're thinking. Isn't Iago also just a generic, poorly designed villain? Yeah, but at least he's entertaining. There's actual nuance in his personality that keeps me interested in what he's got to offer. Hans, there's nothing satisfying about him. He doesn't care, so why should I care? Won't it be great if Hans does have more going for him? Like, at least in Conquest, he could be the straight man to Corrin's impractical methods, seeing through their ruse and playing along just to set things straight for them with his practical mindset. Maybe when he massacred the residents of Sheev, he could directly address how pointless Corrin's peaceful approach is next to people who actually call the shots. But I suppose that's too much to ask from a story like Fates of all games.
You've killed me!
Good.
I know I'm not alone when I say that Elincia's story is pretty underappreciated. She has one of the best character developments in the series, being a once insecure princess who develops into her role as a queen, using her ever-growing fortitude as the very weapon to put a stop to wars and rebellions. Although to be fair, what little screen time she gets in Radiant Dawn certainly doesn't help matters. While her growth is still solid, the conflict she goes up against feels undercooked. And we can blame this asshole for that. Before Hans took the throne as the most boring looking villain in the whole series, Ludwig was the one with the crown. Seriously, he just looks like a generic Crimean knight with Reinhardt's face and a bad nose job slapped onto it. Talk about not even trying to stand out. And no, I don't accept the excuse that he's supposed to be an everyman soldier. Geralt was the villain before him, was also an everyman soldier, and he stands out just fine. Now, the idea behind Ludwig is fine enough. A revolutionary who riles up the people of Crimea to bring Elyncia down so that he can reshape the kingdom the way the people wanted it. And by people, I mean the medieval equivalent of toxic Twitter stans. Seriously, grass is right there. What's these guys' excuse? So there's a decent idea there, but the problem is, Ludwig's barely even on screen throughout the whole thing. The fact that he abducted Lucia and threatened to kill her should have been a big deal, but the whole thing happens and gets resolved so quickly, and Ludwig himself gets swept away from everyone's minds just like that. There's so much missed opportunity to show the dividing nuances of Crimea society, and Ludwig actually taking center stage to speak to the people instead of having his underlings do it for him. We really could have used a couple more chapters to focus on that and, you know, give Elyncia's allies more time to fight so they don't fall behind so much later on. Yes, I get it, the whole deal with Ludwig is that he's weaponizing other people's innate desires and Elyncia's weakness to get his way, so he doesn't actually have to put in the work of being a complex strategist. But I still feel like he could have left more of an impact. Not to mention, Lakain does the same thing, is in the same game, and is way better at it anyway. I think the reason why this guy bothers me so much is that after running away from Crimea for most of Path of Radiance, we finally get to see more of the internal conflict surrounding the kingdom, only for the chapters to be really frustrating and the big bad just being some unremarkable doofus. They already have a solid foundation for the villain. They just needed to give him a better design, more spotlight, and a relevant ending. Or maybe I'm playing into his hands by acting like he deserves more than he should. Who knows? All I know is that I'm gonna be pulling my hair out for a while as to how this guy gets to be in Heroes already, while Nurgle, Raedric, and Lakain are still on the back burner. So here's a bit of a shock boot. Echoes is only number 6. Unlike Grima, fans don't have a lot of good things to say about him. He's just seen as a shoehorned mastermind in a game that already has a messy story regarding choices and morality. Having one big bad be responsible for everything essentially renders any other choice moot if it isn't just taking him down. Then again, Birthright and Conquest already did that with Garon anyway, so it's not like it's much better than either. The biggest issue with Echoes overall is the build-up. Azura tells Corrin the story about how Echoes brought corruption to Vela and the lands above it, so he's the target they should go after from the start. Question is, why didn't she tell Corrin about this earlier? What makes Revelations the one path where Azura suddenly know all this info? It's clear Echoes has been there since before Revelations even happened, so it's not like mentioning him is that big of a taboo. Yeah, I know, Vala curse, but Azura brought Corrin to Vala just fun in Conquest, so what's stopping her from telling them there? See Azura, this is why you're not in Engage. Exposition is your one job and you're not even good at it. At first, Echoes did what you'd expect him to do as a catalyst, summoning soldiers to incite conflict, brainwashing people, etc. But once you actually get into Vala, he just gave up. All you had to deal with is some random kid who transforms into a faceless, and a silly murder mystery with Gunther that really didn't go anywhere. Echoes' plans just seem so confusing and menial. This is a godlike dragon with mind-controlling magic. They seriously could have done more with that. And yet, all that shoddy build-up isn't even the most frustrating part about Echoes. No, the most frustrating part is that his final battle is actually really freaking good! His design is so freakish and eldritch, it's amazing. You actually fight the whole ass dragon instead of just a single solitary target. Every unit plays a vital role in taking down his body before finally finishing off the core. The atmosphere, the giant void looming in the background as all of Vala is falling apart. It's all just so awesome! Which is why it's really depressing that nothing else about him holds up. Echoes is pretty much the opposite of Grima. Grima has a great setup but a poor payoff, while Echoes has a clumsy setup but a spectacular payoff. I'll admit, I do like Echoes more than Grima, but if I were to be objective, Echoes is the worst villain. Imagine having a final boss with Grima tier build-up, an Echoes tier boss fight, and a design equally as radical as the two. Unfortunately, such hope remains a dream for now. As it is, we gotta settle with these half-baked geckos before the time will ever come. For some reason, most Fire Emblem games need to have that one merry band of dark mages going around worshipping dragons and shit. Doesn't it get tiring after a while? Don't you want them to finally start doing something different with the idea of an evil cult? Well, on first glance, the Agarathans seem like they were going for that. Conceptually, Those Who Slither in the Dark has a pretty realistic setup. An organization of mole men who achieved so much scientifically that they believe themselves to be the dominant race. Rather than serving some dragon god, they oppose any sort of divine authority and seek to destroy it all. That's actually a pretty awesome idea for a villain group, and the anachronism of their technology already gave them an edge when it comes to standing out. So how do they screw it up? Simple. They do the exact same thing the other evil cults do. Convoluted plans, having next to no caricature, blackmailing a monarch into doing their bidding, be responsible for every little bad thing that happens in the story to the point where no other character had to be held accountable for their own actions. Don't you just love how the game pussies out on showing Edelgard and Rhea commit crimes against the people, but when the Agarathans do it, it's on full display because they're the bad guys? Grey morale isn't about making sacrifices for what you believe is the greater good. It's about blaming all the world's problems on a single evil faction. Don't think I don't see you copying Fate's homework, treehouses.
It's easy to blame a single thing for all of that. It gives people hope to think the world can be saved with a single heroic deed.
Bullshit.
Oh, but that's not even the worst part. These guys have their own brand of suck to serve on a plate. You know all those corrupt people who are bidding for the Slithers, Cornelia, Arundel, Monica, and so forth? Wanna get to know their backgrounds and why they become corrupt and join the dark side? Well, too bad, because they weren't corrupt. They really are just random innocent folk that the nameless, faceless mole men use as a disguise. Yep, instead of forced brainwashing, they have disguises as an excuse to not hold characters accountable for their villainy. Which will be fine if we actually know anything about the disguise and the disguisee, but say for Monica, we don't. Even with how much the story teases about the details of these characters, they keep getting killed so fast that we don't get to learn anything. Like Death Knight, there isn't much to set these guys apart from your average mook. You know these guys suck when, despite being the catalyst of the entire plot, the story didn't even take them seriously enough to deal with them properly in all the paths. We get Claude and the church actually doing their part, but Dimitri just defeats them accidentally, and Edelgard wins via last-minute exposition. Yup, never mind that they can drop fucking missiles from the stratosphere, and that Edelgard killed the one person who could have actually dealt with them. She just wins because the developers didn't want to upset her fans. Even though in a sensible timeline, we'd get the second coming of FE4 Gen 2. So much for trying to mimic Kaga, huh? I only have a few good things to say about these guys. Their designs for one are actually pretty decent. Kranya is sleek enough, not having too many accessories on her, and Thalas's armor looks pretty radical. But let's be real here, Nemesis carried the whole gang. He may just be their puppet hero, but he definitely exudes the presence of a man who came from nothing and earned the title of God Killer. He is the one saving grace the Slithers have. But other than that, these guys are not but a carbonated mess. Any chance the writers have to develop them is spent on creating more questions no one wants to answer. It's so obvious that they were trying to recapture the magic of the Lapta clan with these guys, which mind you is not the first time they tried it and f***ed up, when the grey dilemma of three houses would have worked infinitely better if these guys were never here to begin with. If you really want to tell a complex story that gets across themes and messages without any backhanding, you have to learn to let go of a formula or subvert it according to the themes of your narrative. Otherwise, you might as well tell a simple black and white story, and it will have been the same anyway. You all can fight me on this one. Engage has some of the most solid roster of villains the series has had in a while. They may not be all that deep or complex, but they manage to be entertaining, threatening, and offer enough intrigue to keep their part of the story interesting. That said, yeah, Sombron sucks. Maybe it's just me, but I feel like they've really run their course with designing these evil dragon villains. The humanoid form looks just as garish and over-designed as the average Awakening and Fates villain. The dragon form? Yeah, the Cobra Dragon combo looks neat, but I don't know, does it really scream final boss to you? Like, even compared to the other dragons on this list. Grima? That's a final boss. And Ankos? That's a final boss. Sombron just looks like the final boss's underling. Not much about him feels all that grand. To make it even more rickety, any and all details about Sombron as a character is shoved at the very end of the game. After being built up as a monster who treats his children like weapons, the game seriously expects us to feel engaged by his little personal journey to find an old friend in the form of some conspicuous emblem we don't even know the name of. The attempt to humanize him is so drawn out and pathetic that it hilariously subtracts from his character. His final battle is On top of a really silly power of friendship setup, Sombron is yet another single target boss that doesn't require a lot of thought to beat outside of bum rushing. Yeah, he's got those dark emblems which also provides a bit of a neat fan service, but you don't even really need to take them all down to do enough damage to him. It's not terrible, but after the complex final battles of Revelations in 3 houses, this is underwhelming as shit. The only part I like with Sombron is when he talks with Zephyr about intercourse for some reason.
Hey, there's a PG-13 channel.
It's such a strange little exchange that it's just funny. So knowing that Sombron is this poorly made with next to no redeeming qualities, why isn't he any higher on the list? Well, it's because the rest of Engaged villains are so good that one bad egg didn't really spoil the bunch. He takes a backseat for most of the game like a good, crappy final boss, while the Hounds get all the spotlight they deserve. Generally speaking, he's inoffensive, especially when compared to how much worse the top 3 is. I'm gonna be honest, I don't hate Manfroy, and I don't hate the Lapta clan either. Unlike other evil cults who only exist for shits and giggles, Manfroy and his people actually have a reason for being so evil. Being a tribe hunted down by the common populace over their heritage, it damped their legacy so much that they become paranoid, believing that they can only thrive from the evil that feeds their demon god. The problem is that rather than being explored as the victims of a tragic history, they are just treated as generic, irredeemable bad guys who just had to be responsible for every little bad thing that happened in Jagdral. Not helping the case is one of the higher-ranking officers of the clan, Bishop Vel. I don't know about you, but when I think of final bosses, I usually think of a character with a strong presence. Someone who, even just based on appearance, bears strong command over the antagonistic force of the story. Vel? He just looks like any other boring cultist. Sure, you could argue Raidrick is the same, but even he has unique features. Vel just has no pupils. Nothing about him really screams mastermind. All he does is turn evil into stone, and that's it. I know that makes his confrontation with Leaf more personal, but Leaf doesn't even meet him until the very end of Thracia 776. There's hardly any catharsis when the two didn't interact at all. But even despite all that, I will admit, I actually like how Velt was written at first. I like how he was sort of a no-nonsense supervisor to Raidrick, constantly berating him for his reckless antics and putting up with all his desperate flattery. For a moment, there's a fairly enjoyable character to be seen here. But all of that was essentially erased when the story dropped a really stupid bombshell.
Reckon the plot because I told you to.
Because you told me to!
Right before the final battle, Velt randomly drops a tidbit on how he's the one responsible for persuading Travant into killing Quan and Ethlin. Yeah, remember the 8th massacre? That one shocking moment in Geneaology that sets a precedent on how cunning and dangerous Travant is? Yeah, turns out none of that matters because according to this random ass cultist, Travant isn't smart enough to plan things out on his own, despite the many instances that prove he is smart enough to do it. Tell me, why shall I believe a word this guy says? What, is it because that's how the author made it? Yeah, imagine having a villain doing something that adds into the intrigue and quality of their character, be abruptly ruined because turns out it was all someone else's plan. Isn't it just great that good writing can be instantly stomped out just because the author felt like changing things out of nowhere? Truly, that's pinnacle world building, am I right?
Your best invention was a way to steal credit.
Velt would have passed off as a decent final hurdle for the story if he didn't suddenly become a retcon device to show how in control the Lapta clan is. And on top of that, given how much of a blank slate he is, he could have been the one villain used to explore more of the grey dynamics surrounding the Lapta clan. He could have had interactions with Salim and Sarah, debating whether or not a Laptarian should accept a chance at redemption after everything they've been through. Considering how the Jotgrill games are often praised for having such a grand and deep story, I believe even that idea isn't above the resume. Which is why even when all things considered, Velt has no excuse to suck this much. Oh, and one last thing. Fuck that final chapter. Fuck Canis. Fuck having to randomly arrange units on the map. And most of all, fuck you for being a pathetic final boss, you stony dick.
I'm so glad you made it home.
Garen, the most reviled villain in the entire series. Not because he's good at being evil or anything, but because his character really sucks at everything it's meant to stand for. A lot of people say that Corrin is the biggest problem with Fate's story. I disagree. While I'm not necessarily excusing Corrin's stupidity, they do have moments where they genuinely shine. Their sharpness in Birthright especially makes them a fairly tolerable protagonist to follow. It wasn't much, but it's something. Garen, on the other hand, completely fails as a primary villain in all the 3 stories he's featured in. And therein lies problem number 1. Why does Fate even have a primary villain? Isn't the big selling point of Fate's story is that you get to choose your allies and the path you believe is necessary to prosperity? What's the point of debating which path you should take if both of them lead you back to a singular main villain anyway? The only difference is that one path is completely straightforward and bland, while the other paints everyone as idiots who trust a bunch of irredeemable bad guys. Speaking of irredeemable, there's problem number 2 for you. Garon is not interesting. At all. The game wanted us to believe that this corrupt-ass conqueror was once a good man, but we only ever get that from Xander and Leo giving exposition via their support convos. Because Garon never shows any sign of humanity in present time, everything Xander said felt so disconnected from the character that it's hard to buy any of it. It's frustrating seeing someone as noble as Xander make these kindergarten-level excuses for Garon's obviously shitty behavior. Add a hideously drab design and jerking off to Echoes as a hobby, and you get an ideal serving of snore. And problem number 3, he's just the silent dragon's bitch. The story invests so much time putting Garon on a holy grail as this super important threat, only to throw him in the trash can the instant a bigger bat rolls in. Now you could say that's more of a problem with Echoes, but that will only be the case if Garon is actually a good character at all, which he is not. Garon is just an empty husk who wastes all of our time. He's generic, unimportant, uninsightful, and the story keeps trying to pretend he's more complex than he actually is. So that begs the question, who could be worse than Garon? He's about as low as it gets with the villains in the series, isn't he? Well, I certainly don't disagree that he is the worst by technicality. On a grander scale, however, there's another set of villains that get under my skin way more. As usual, before we get to number 1, let's look at some dishonorable mentions. Ephidel, Blazing Sword. Imagine being built up as a conniving assassin, only to randomly die in a cutscene. Zola, Fates. An attempt was made to give him more story and birthright, and it didn't go anywhere. Velazark, Warriors. I get it's a spin-off title, but come on, we could get something more than just another generic dragon. Epimenides, Three Hopes. Great, an extension of the Agarthans that further convolutes them rather than flesh them out. When I had discussions about Fire Emblem villains with some friends, colleagues, and strangers alike, I found a surprising amount of people who actually liked Gangrel. I personally hated him at first because of how shallow and badly designed he is, but looking back, I suppose I can see where his appeal is. Some people do get a kick out of him being a rotten piece of shit, and as someone who also liked a lot of villains like that, I can see where they're coming from. I guess I was a bit soured by the bonus content trying to redeem him, and yet this game's attitude towards villains don't really do that justice. But for the limited role he's meant to play, I suppose I can give him a break. Unfortunately, his shortcoming comes from the fact that most of the other major villains are literally no better than he is. I'm of course talking about what I consider to be the worst group of villains in the entire series, the Grimleals. Oh great, another evil cult. This time with none of the flavors that make the others stand out. No creative appeal, and barely any emphasis on tragedy. These guys are so phoned in, it barely even feels like they're a looming threat. I'm not even joking, you could take most of their encounters out of the first 2 acts of the game and barely anything will change. Now, I won't take too much issue with this if the generals are any good, but just no. They have eye-gouging designs, personality of pea-soaked tissue papers, and they take away spotlight from villains that will have been so much more interesting than they are. Exilus is the least terrible of the 3, but that's not saying much. His whole character is centered around rubbing how disorienting and hideous he is right in your face. He's a pathetic loudmouth who tries to be Gangrel 2.0, only with even less redeeming qualities, and goes out as pathetically as you'd expect him to. Aversa is a nothing burger. She's just a boring old secretary who's there as an extension to whoever she's serving. Why is she even a spot pass recruit? They're probably trying to add more to this cardboard cutout, but if they didn't even give her anything to work with firsthand, what even is the point? And the worst one of the bunch, Valadar. Oh lord, do I hate this guy. Not only is he everything bland and unlikable about an evil cult leader, but he is so bad at his job. He keeps blatantly exposing himself to the heroes to the point where they have all the time to see his attacks coming, and when they have time travel by their side, he does nothing to deal with it. No contingency plans, nothing. He just lets everything play out because they can't change their destiny, and that turned out so well, didn't it? He is so irrationally incompetent that Grima, yes, his own master, had to save his ass. And since Grima's plan was to use their own power to control their past self anyway, nothing Veladar did meant anything and he just gets tossed away like a used up sock. Now yes, I know some will make the argument that he did win in at least one timeline, but that's only because he had the element of surprise by his side. Which begs the question, why did he think exposing himself to Chrom and Robin is a good idea when they already know he tried to assassinate Emerin? When you make your main villain this careless and ignorant, do you really expect me to believe that he'd succeed if he wasn't getting rescued like a damsel in distress every step of the way? F that! And adding to all of that, these guys robbed the story off of one of the game's most important plot points, Chrom's character development. After having to make sacrifices to stop Gangrel and liberate Plegia, Chrom didn't get to live up to Emerin's diplomatic values as well as he should have. Why? Because instead of finding genuine alliance with Plegia, Veladar just takes it over and makes them enemies again. And since Chrom didn't get the satisfaction with the Valn army either, his development got cut off midway and we go back to remorselessly killing these crappy Lapta clan ripoffs. So that leaves Chrom's friend-making stunts relegated to bonus chapters, where his past enemies turned out to still be alive so he can rehabilitate them, negating the consequences behind his growth.
Gotta love fanfiction where all the good guys live.
If I want a scheming dark sorcerer who's actually threatening and well put together, I'd stick with Jeddah from the Valentia saga. He did everything Veladar did before, after, and better. His cult is a natural part of Valentia society, and he's the villain of Celica's story in particular, so he managed to be a consistent threat without taking away from the villains of Alm's story. He's an example of a dark wizard mastermind done right. Okay, I know you might think I'm being a bit too harsh on the Grimleals. Awakening does have a limited development model, so it didn't have a lot of luxury to get everything right. At least compared to Garen and the Agarthans, who keep coming back over and over and still sucking. But here's the thing, Awakening is not the first Fire Emblem game. There are tons more villains in the past games they could have taken inspiration from, some of which would have taken less work to put together than an evil cult and would have worked so much better in context of Awakening's themes. But instead, they got too ballsy and copied a popular archetype too dark and heavy for the story they're going for, but couldn't go all in and half-assed it big time. And thanks to all of that, the Grimleals wind up setting a new, super low bar for future Fire Emblem villains. It's why I'm not the least bit surprised that Fate's villains are as bad as they are because, well, just look at what came before it. It really soured my impression on upcoming villains for a while, and even the good ones don't soften the blow by much given their non-traditional elements. Which is why I'm so thankful that Engage assured me the villains are getting better each game. Seeing how the developers are more willing than ever to experiment with different ideas, we'll just have to see what sort of bundle we'll be getting with the next set of villains. Whatever the case, I'll be looking forward to either loving it or hating it wherever it matters.